Da, da, mă putem să vă zic.
Nu știu dacă succes este pe cineva care și-a dat la ne spuneam de foarte bun. Tot înțeles, mai Are color
Bucurăm să vă avem cea de doua se pare că vom asculta astăzi pe Robert Sham, care este invitatul nostru special și căruia îi spunem bun venit, Robert Sham, și o să rugăm să susținem speech-ul pe care l-a pregătit. Eu o să spun că l-am spus. Este acreditat ca analist comportamental, este coautor al mai multor lucrări de specialitate, pe care este au intervenit cu teritoriul analitici. Este de asemenea coautor al unui capitol de comportament verbal în una Universitatea Titu Maiorescu. Și în activitatea sa profesională am încercat să apuncă toate cercetările științifice în manualele instructive pentru copii și copii și pentru specialiști, în așa fel încât să le fie luat împreună cu aplicații practice în activitatea pe care o fac copiii cu deficiențe motorice și nu cu psihologie. Îl invităm pe Robert Sham să vină și să ne ținem un speech și să spuneți întrebările pe care le putem din Robert Sham.
How is everyone? Now, that seems like a lovely introduction. I have no idea what to say. I'm hoping it was nice. Yes, I'm here today to speak on two topics in the field of data analysis. The first is applied behavior analysis with an emphasis on verbal behavior. The second, I'm going to be discussing an approach to earning instructional control with children or clients that we're working with. I'm going to do my best to speak at a rate so that the translator can get the information across to you. Just let me know if I'm speaking too fast. Also, I realize that for many of you, I sound like a lovely Romanian woman. How many people are using the translator? Okay, good. So to you, I sound much more lovely than I do to the rest, I'm sure. So, let's get started. I'm going to talk to you about verbal behavior and what that offers us in the ABA program. Much of what I talk about through both of these sections is information that's available in my book that's called Motivation and Reinforcement, Turning the Tables on Autism. And it's a teaching manual for the verbal behavior approach to ABA. Now, depending on who you talk to, there are going to be people who suggest that verbal behavior approach is not necessarily anything new or different. I'm going to explain to you what I believe the benefits of understanding the research-based Skinner's verbal behavior offers. And I'm going to talk a lot about motivating operations, things that Dr. Jack Michael has spoken about and written about that help us to better understand the antecedent condition to teaching. And what I think we're going to come to is a realization that understanding the verbal behavior aspects, those two main issues, functional classification of language and motivation, will offer us an incredible amount of benefit in our normal teaching. And so by prioritizing this in our approach, we find that we can make better results in many of our children. So let's get a little bit to the topic now. First is the terminology of verbal behavior. What is verbal behavior? It's very common to think that we're just talking about spoken language. And that's not the way that it was defined by Skinner. Verbal behavior is any behavior that is specifically reinforced by another person. So anything that I do that is going to be reinforced by another person will be considered verbal behavior, whether it's spoken or not. If I were to make a motion and you were to imitate that, my motion would be verbal behavior in that it was an attempt to gain reinforcement from another person. Does that make sense? So any behavior that affects the environment of a listener is potentially verbal behavior. The term verbal behavior was defined by Skinner in his 1957 book called Verbal Behavior. And major deficits that affect children with autism specifically are social interaction and communication. And when you think about social interaction and communication issues, you're talking about verbal behavior. In fact, verbal behavior is, to some degree, 2/3 of the types of behavior we work with. You have behavior that's meant to gain something from another person. You have behavior that's meant to remove things from another person. And then you have self-stimulatory behavior. Well, anything that deals with a listener, deals with another person, is going to be considered verbal behavior. So it's an important topic to understand. The names behind this approach to ABA, just a few of them are listed here. Obviously, E.F. Skinner, who first famously categorized behavior, verbal behavior, in his book, 57. Then you have Dr. Jack Michael, who spoke and wrote on motivating operations. Dr. Mark Sundberg, who was instrumental along with Joe Stradlin in creating assessments that are based on a better understanding of verbal behavior. And then you've got people who've been helping to promote it within the science and without, people like Vince Carbone, Patrick McGreevy, and others. So there are three major areas in which verbal behavior helps and affects our ABA program. I'm going to speak about two of them today. In my normal 2-day workshop, I will be covering all three. But the two that I'm going to cover in this first section is the function of language, otherwise known as Skinner's behavioral classification of language. The second is the concept of motivation, which is often called the motivating operation or the establishing operation. There's also a benefit in understanding that there are three different types of teaching available to us. And if I have more time, that's something that I will get into as well. Although I don't plan to cover that today. How are we doing as far as my timing is concerned? Can everybody, is the translation keeping up? Yeah. So let's talk about the behavioral classification of language. What Skinner did is he realized that a word is not defined by its form. the letters of a word, the way a word sounds, has nothing to do with the word's value. The value of a word is 100% dependent upon its function for the speaker in regards to the listener. The words that I say only have value to me because of what they do to affect you. Otherwise, there would be no value that wasn't self-stimulatory. Skinner broke down language into many different categories, explained all different parts of language and how it is developed through the same behavioral contingencies that affect all of our behavior. But there are 9 basic classifications that we can teach you that will really make a difference in our ability to help children with the diagnosis of autism or other related disorders. What's important to know is that these 9 different classifications or categories are all separate in their function. And because they are separate, and because children with disabilities, particularly children with autism, may have difficulty generalizing skills that they learn, it is often important that we have to teach language across each and every category. If we teach language in only one category, it's quite possible that the child will only have the ability to use it under that function. They won't transfer it to the other functions, language. So, when we look at a traditional style of ATA program, one that doesn't take into consideration verbal behavior, you generally would talk about language as being 2 things, either receptive or expressive. Is that how you guys generally hear about language being discussed? Receptive or expressive language. There's the language that we receive from others, and then there's the language that we give out to the world. Now, when we look at some of the traditional ADA programs, especially early on in the 70s and 80s, a lot was taught with receptive language first, getting a child to show understanding of language, with the hope that expressive language would then follow. What we realize now is that if a child is missing skills in any of the categories of language, there's a chance that they will not become a fully functioning communicator. And their ability to interact with the world around them will be hindered, will be hurt. So we want to make sure that we're not just teaching receptive versus expressive, because when you look at the functions of language, you realize that receptive is only 1/9 of these basic categories. And that the expressive deals with 8 other categories that need to be separated and considered individually and taught to. What I'm going to do is go through some of these different categories with you and make sure that you understand all the different functions that we generally have to deal with in teaching our learners. I have a list of them here. Receptive language, which we're all familiar with. Then you have something called the MAM. You have motor imitation, the echoic, otherwise known as verbal imitation, the tact, the intraverbal. You have something that's called feature function in class, which was something that has been parsed out separately by Dr. Sambata and Arlington. It's not generally a separate category of language, but because of the complexity of it, it's nice to think of it separately. And then you have textual, which is reading, and you have writing. So these are the different functions of language. And if we're not teaching each function, our children will ultimately not become the communicators that they need to be successful, and to eradicate the behavioral issues that come with their diagnosis. So the first topic we're going to talk about is fairly familiar to many of you, receptive language. This is the ability to follow instructions or to comply with the requests of others. What's important to understand about receptive language, which is also known in science as listener skills, is that the responding to these types of answers or answering to questions is always going to be nonverbal. If I respond with a verbal response, a vocal response, then it's not going to be considered receptive language. So if someone were to say, give me a cup, or give me a bottle of water, my physically handing them the bottle of water is receptive language. It's my demonstration of understanding of that information. If someone points to dad as a response to, where's your dad? That would be receptive language. Now, if someone said to you, where's your dad? And you said, he's in the kitchen, would that be receptive language? No, because it's a vocal response. This response being vocal makes it not receptive language. Running into the kitchen when someone says, show me where you eat lunch, would be considered a receptive language response. Receptive language is not half of what we have to teach. It's important, but it's a small portion of what we have to teach. And it generally doesn't need to be taught first. If you're still working under older style ABA programs, you might still believe that we want to teach receptive language first, develop and express later. But the research has not bear that out. In the early behavior approach, we're addressing all functions of language at different levels right from the beginning. In fact, one of the first functions of language we're going to address in any program is not going to be receptive language necessarily, but most importantly, we're going to want to address the man. Now, how many of you are familiar with the terminology, the man? Good, maybe less than half. For those of you who are not familiar, I'm going to use the word request to share with you. A man is anything that someone does that is an attempt to gain something from another person. So it's not just asking questions, but anything that I do in order to get something from another person. That was a man. My look, reach, and motion here was a man. What made a man was the fact that it came from a desire. The desire to have something is what starts the process. So my movement of walking and doing this was all under the motivation of a desire to have something. So that action would be considered a command. Anything we do in an attempt to gain items, information, activity, actions from another person would be considered a command. And there are many different levels of commanding. Commanding is the only form of language that is generally initiated by the child. All the other forms of language are responses to other people's language. So it's extremely important that if you're going to teach a child to communicate, and a child who may not be initiating with others, you have to understand the demand, and you have to teach it early, and you have to focus on it often. You also don't want to teach the man as an answer to a question. I don't want you to say to your child, what do you want? And expect him to say water as a man. Because what happens is your child will learn that a man is a response, and that answering question, asking for things you want is only allowable when someone has first spoken to you. So in our programs, we're going to make sure that we don't ask what you want. In fact, you'll never hear us use it in our modern programs. We did 5, 6, 7, 8 years ago. That's 1, 8, 9, 10 years ago. But now we avoid using what you want. The only time we allow our therapists or the parents that we're working with to say, what do you want, is if they don't know what the child wants. And that makes sense, because that's when it's useful. But if you know the child is reaching for water, and you want to teach them to say water, the last thing you want to be doing is saying, what do you want? Because you're teaching him that manning is a response, not an initiation. And children who are taught that manning is a response will be less likely to use spontaneous mannings, spontaneous language. They'll be less likely to then use spontaneous text as well, which we're going to get to shortly. So if your child is crying because they want something, is crying a manning? It is. If they're pointing, is that a manning? Yeah. If they say, can I please have that cookie, not the green one, but the chocolate chip cookie with the sprinkles on top? Obviously that's a manning as well. But it's a higher level manning, and it's the type of thing we work towards. The next functional language that we need to be aware of is motor imitation. All motor movements that a child makes that are an attempt to copy motor movements that they see. Now, we do a lot of motor imitation teaching in early programs. Why do you think ABA spends so much time in beginning programs working on imitation skills? If you think about what we all learn, correct? If you think about what we all learn early in our lives, a vast majority of it, from age 0 to 5 and beyond, we learn through imitation. Even to this day, you walk into unfamiliar situations, your instinct, your first coping mechanism is to see what the other people are doing and to start to imitate it. I saw a study recently which I thought was interesting. They put 5 people in a focus group and they asked them questions about a PowerPoint presentation. And they would ask them in front of each other one at a time. And at one point in the PowerPoint, they put up something that was clearly, A was clearly bigger than B. But 4 of the 5 people in there were actors. And they put the person who they were testing near the end. And they asked the first person, is A or B bigger? And the person said B. And then the second person said B. B, B. Then they get to the person who's not an actor, the person that the test is about. And like 80% of the time, that person will say B, even though it's obvious that A was bigger, to not stand out differently from the other people in the test. We imitate the things that we see, we imitate the things that we hear. It's a coping skill. It's been reinforced strongly in our lives. However, the difference between children with autism diagnosis and typical children often comes right back to a lack of imitation skills. You will see kids that when we put them on our assessments have almost no ability to imitate what they see at all. Yet with my 2 daughters, easily 80 to 90% of everything they learn in the first 5 years of their lives is through imitating what they see. So we have to teach imitation as well. And imitation also has different levels. Starts with something very basic. Do this. And it goes to being able to see a group of people doing something and then imitating what you see them do. Or being able to imitate something you saw yesterday. Next you have the vocal imitation, or the encoding. And this is any sound or word that you use that's an attempt to copy words or sounds of others. So if someone says hello and you say hello, that's vocal imitation. If you were to tell me your phone number and I repeated it back to you to make sure that I got it right, to make sure that or to help myself remember, those would be functional uses of the verbal behavior, of the verbal imitation. Now, verbal imitation, or the echoic, is extremely important in early expressive language. Because although we don't use it that often in our everyday lives as adults, it's a prerequisite skill to everything else that we do. Most of our children will not learn to demand, ask for things using language if they haven't first learned how to echo that language. So it becomes one of the early things we have to teach as well. And then later we can transfer echoic responses to manned responses and to other categories of language as well. The next we're going to talk about the tact. The tact is a form of language that deals with having contact with something in the environment and being able to label that. So if I ask you, what is this? And you say, a bottle of water. What you've just done is you've tacted the water. You've used the tact form of language. Labeling something that's in your environment. Now, we talk about the environment a lot in ABA. What do we mean when we say the environment? So if I'm going to tag something that's in the environment of the child, and I'm going to ask them to tag it. What does in the environment mean? Is it anything in the city? Any stimulus that what? Any stimulus that affects the child's senses. So if they can hear a dog barking in the other room, and they say, oh, a dog, that would be a tax as well. If you said to a child, what did I give you yesterday? And he says a bottle of water. Is that a tax? No, it's not. The bottle of water is not currently in the environment, so it is not a tax. That would be a different form of language, a different function of language, which we're going to talk about soon. Okay, let's talk about it now. It's called the interverbal. An interverbal is using words that are controlled by other words, but are not copies of those other words. If I copy a word you say, then that's a vocal imitation or an echo. But if you say a word and that directly controls my decision to say other words, then those words are interverbals. To me, interverbals are one of the best ways to understand that language is behavior. We learn language through the same principles of behavior as everyone else, as every other behavior. If you don't think that your words are controlled by other people's words, think about this. If I ask you your name, what do you say? Gabriel. I'm glad it was a name I could pronounce. I asked him, what's your name? He says Gabriel. That's a picture verbal. Now, I could have asked him, what is your name? And he could have said anything he wanted. He has free will. No one is forcing him to say Gabriel. It's his choice to say whatever he wants. We understand this. But why does he always say Gabriel or some form of that? Maybe in a professional context, he might say it's only. Why do we say Gabriel? Because the word Gabriel, the spoken word Gabriel, in response to that question, has been so consistently reinforced for him. However, it hasn't been reinforced for any of you. Are any of you named Gabriel? No? Okay. The 5 girls in the front say their name is not Gabriel. That's good to know. So Gabriel itself has never been reinforced for you. Your name has been. The reason we identify as the person we are with the name that we do is 100% reliant upon the reinforcement that comes from responding a certain way. Your parents gave you the opportunity to respond, and every time they said your brother's name and you responded, you would more likely than not get what you were looking for, or wouldn't benefit from that. But when they said your name and they were holding up a candy, boy, responding to that sure did work. So everything, all of our language is very clearly supported by by the principles of behavior. That's how it's developed, that's how it grows, that's how we become who we become. Anything that you say that is controlled by another person's words is going to be considered introverted. Unless you're naming an item that's in the environment at the time, because then it's what? Attacked. The next category we're going to talk about is feature, function, and class. Now, the feature, function, and class, we're not talking about a specified category or function of language. But Dr. Mark Sundberg, and Dr. Jim Farthington in their assessments, which I will talk about briefly in the coming slides, decided that they wanted to pull feature, function, and class apart and teach it separately because it's where language begins to blossom. I can teach you to demand for something. You can say water. I can teach you to respond in a receptive language to water. If I said, show me the water. I can teach you to label the water. What is this? And you say water. I can even teach you to answer a verbal invitation. I'm sorry, an interrogative about water. What did I give you to drink yesterday? Water. But the next form in really opening up a child's language is through the features, functions, and classes. Because all of our language gets categorized and used based upon how it fits together. There are specific features, functions, and classes to most everything that we teach our kids. For example, yes, this is water, but a feature of water is that it is wet. So I need a child not only to be able to say water when I ask him about water, but he needs to be able to name water when I say, tell me something that is wet. Okay? That would be a feature of water. What is the function of water? Name something that you drink, or name something that you use to clean yourself. Those are two separate functions of water. Name something you wash your dishes with. Water, just like anything else, may have several functions. It may also have several features. Then you've got the class. What is water? What is water class? A liquid. You could use, in English, we might also use the word fluid. But liquid is or a beverage. A beverage is something that are things that you drink. So there can be several classes. What I want you to understand is that if you're going to teach a child the concept of water, and you want them to be a fully functioning communicator in regards to water, you have to teach them how to man for water, how to label or tact water, how to answer about water in a direct question. You have to teach them how to imitate in regards to water, how to vocally say the word water as an imitation. You also have to teach them all the features, functions, and classes of water that would be appropriate for them to know at their age. That's a lot of target skills for water. It's a little bit different than earlier ABA programs where they taught water as receptive or suppressive. What is this? Oh, I'm sorry. Show me the water. That's receptive. Mastered. We got it. Done. What is this? Water. That's the expressive. Done. Let's move on to something else. Well, you can do that, but you end up with children who generally only have receptive and tacting. It was not uncommon in early ABA programs for a child to have 200, 300 tacts. You can hold a picture after picture, and they name that thing. But they never once would have asked for those things in their environment. They couldn't answer questions about them. They had no idea about the feature function in class. Now, what's important to know about feature function in class is it actually goes across 3 different categories. You can have feature function in class receptive. Show me the thing that is wet. Show me the thing that you drink. Show me where is the beverage. You can also have it as a tact. Name something you drink. Name something that is wet. Name something that is a beverage. You can also have it as an interverbal. Tell me something you can drink when there's no water available to drink. Tell me something that is wet. Tell me something that is a beverage. So think about this. In teaching language to a child who's nonverbal, who's becoming verbal, if I want to teach the concept of water, I have to teach receptive, manding, tacting, intraverbal, motor notation, on down the list, and then eventually when I get to feature function in class, there might be 3 features, 2 functions, and 2 classes. So that's 7, 8 new targets. And each of those targets has to be taught receptively, with tacting, and with interverbal. So now we're talking a total of 30, 40 different targets for one concept. And then we have to talk about the difference between different types of things. Water is not a great example, but there's a difference between this chair and other types of chairs. So you have to go across multiple examples as well. So you can see how big the challenge is. For typical children, these things are learned automatically. They start to imitate what they see, then they start to imitate what they hear, then they start to be able to generalize by labeling, asking for things. It comes naturally. For our children with autism, when it doesn't come naturally, it has to specifically be taught. If you don't fully understand these functional classifications of language and teach each and every one of them, you may not be as successful as you want to be in teaching your child. The last 2 categories of function are textual, which is reading written words or letters, and writing, which is writing or typing words or letters that are spoken. These are more academic skills. We generally address these when the children in the classroom would start working on these. That's when we would start addressing these. I don't work on these right from the beginning. But the other ones we do work on at the beginning. So now I'm going to take a minute and talk about a couple of assessments. One is called the ABLES, also now known as the ABLES R, because it's 3 buckets. And the other one is the reading app. How many of you are currently using the ABLES R or reading app? Okay, that's a much smaller number of people. I'm actually very glad that as many of you that raised your hand have heard about the functional classification of language. This is extremely, extremely important in your ability to teach. These assessment tools are extremely valuable to you in your ability to teach because they parse out all of the different functions of language for you, and they tell you what typical children would learn normally. So The assessment of basic language and learning skills was originally done by Mark Sunberg and Jim Arlington. Difflearn.com is the place where you can order it. It is available in a couple of languages. I'm not sure if it is in your language. I don't know. I would imagine probably not. But it doesn't take much. It takes one person with a little bit of money and a little bit of effort to contact them and say, we want this, and make it available for things to be translated. My book is translated into 5 different languages now. And all it took was a parent or a therapist who said, I want people to read this. And so I gave them permission to do the translation. We worked with a publisher, and now it's available in French, and Spanish, and German, and Russian. The other one is the Verbal Behavior Milestones and Placement Program, which can be found at apex.com. What the value of these assessments are is that they break down language by these functional categories. And they give you target skills to work towards. I'm going to close this down for just 1 second. And show you this one. This is a little boy named Timo that we work with in Germany. When we first started working with him, it was June of 2006. We assessed him on the assessment of basic language and learning skills, the ABLES. See these different towers? Each tower is a different function of language. Well, to some degree. The first tower deals with cooperation. The reason we deal with cooperation in BB programs has to do with the later topics I'm going to speak about, motivation and instructional control. But the first category deals with how cooperative is the child you're working with? How much do they respond to reinforcement in their environment? The second category is visual performance. This is how we children interact with the environment, the items in the environment that they see. This is going to be usually more self-stimulatory than others. Things like puzzles and form boxes and categorize and draw. But then we get into the categories of language. The first one is receptive language. If I want to teach a child to be a fully functioning communicator, I need to know that they can fill in all of these boxes in the receptive language category. Why? Because this is what typical children learn to do automatically. Most of them automatically learn this just as a part of growing up. They have these skills by the time they reach age 4, 5, 6, some maybe as late as 7 or 8. But if all children are learning these skills, then the child you want to teach needs to learn them as well. So if we put the children on this assessment, in this case, in June of 05, I guess it was, 06, I can't see. Yeah, 05. What he had, he was a very cooperative child. He had a few splinter skill areas that he could do in visual performance. He had some receptive language. These are things like, can a child respond to his own name? Does he turn and look at you up? Does he come? Does he do it with prompting? Or does he do it regularly all the time, whenever you call him? Does the child follow instructions to do fun things when you ask him? If you're standing on the trampoline and you say, jump, so he starts to jump. Will he look at items and you say, hey, look at this? Will he look and identify the things that you want him to? And it goes up from there. This is following instructions in routine settings. Like, will he throw something in the garbage and you say, look at this in the garbage? Will go put on your shoes? Is he able to follow those? And then how many can he do? Can you do at least 3 different activities without prompts in the beginning? And it goes up higher and higher. You eventually get to things like, can they respond to issues related to same and different? Show me which of these are the same. Show me which of these are different from each other. Show me which of these are his shoes. Which of these are her shoes? Which of these is not furniture? As you see, it gets more and more complicated as you go on. If you want to help a child be a fully functional communicator, they have to have all these skills. And this assessment allows you to identify what skills they have, what they're missing, and what will be the next skills that you would be most likely to want to teach. In addition to receptive language, it also has motor imitation, verbal imitation, manding, tacting, introverbals. It also covers spontaneous language. And in addition to language, they give you other categories as well. Grammar, play and leisure, social interaction, group instruction, and it goes on down. Gross motor fine motor. But where this assessment is really special, where it's really most valuable to us, is right along here in these top categories. There's also an assessment called the DB map. This is newer, also developed by Dr. Mark Sundberg. It's becoming very popular. A lot of people are switching from the ABLES to the DB map. Our company uses both. So that's my little section on the importance of the understanding the functions of language. It's extremely important that you can teach to all of these different skills. And what's really cool about it is even though your child may not generalize very well, you may teach them to man or something, and then you have to teach them to tap, label it. And then you can teach them to answer introvertly, and then you can teach them to do feature function in class. Then you start with your new topic, chairs. Well, you have to teach them to man, and then you have to teach them to tap. As you teach more and more, you start to build bridges between these different categories. So what we find is that after teaching across all the categories several times for several different things, suddenly the generalization starts to happen and take place on its own. So you're not going to have to teach across all these categories forever for most children. So that was the first area in which verbal behavior has really helped us to improve our understanding of ABA. The second area, and what I think is the most important, really came with the writings of Dr. Jack Michael and others at the time about understanding motivation. To me, the secret to optimal learning for a child is motivation. Oh. That is very nice. So, what is motivation? Well, in the science of behaviorism, motivation is known as the motivating operation, or it's sometimes called the establishing operation. How many of you are familiar with these terms? Okay. Less than the functions of language, but more than are using the ABLES and the DB-MAP. Somewhere in the middle of that. A motivating operation is important to understand because traditional ABA programs that don't take into account verbal behavior research are going to be very strongly focused on reinforcement. Reinforcement is the main principle behind everything we do. What is going to occur after the behavior that makes that behavior be more likely in the future? That's everything in ABA, right? We give a child a form of behavior, and then we make sure something follows it that will reinforce that behavior, make it more likely to occur. And then on the flip side, when we see behavior that we don't want to see again, we have to then make sure that there's a consequence that follows that behavior that it doesn't reinforce it, whether it be a lack of reinforcement or some form of punishment. When I talk about an MO or an EO, that's what we're talking about, motivating operation or an establishing operation. People use these terms synonymously, the same. There's a little bit of a difference. And let me get into the definition of a motivating operation. An MMO, a motivating operation, is anything that temporarily changes the value of a reinforcer. Interesting. The value of a reinforcer is changing temporarily. What do we have to work with in ABA? We have reinforcers. We have things that we know reliably increase the behavior they follow. When we teach a child across the A, B, C paradigm, we give them an antecedent that we hope to become an SD. We say, show me your nose. And I want that word, those words, to become a discriminated stimulus that lets the child know what to do. And what are they supposed to do when they hear that? Point to their nose or touch their nose. And what do I have to do to make sure that that happens? I have to make sure that reinforcement follows when they touch their nose. We have a three-term contingency here that's extremely important to learn. I say touch your nose, the child touches their nose, something positive for the child happens that causes them to be more likely to touch their nose again when they see that same distributed stimulus, that SD. That's what teaching is all about. How do we teach? Well, we use prompts with our SDs. We give the SD the instruction, touch your nose, and then maybe we help the child to do it. Then we follow that prompted response with reinforcement. The reinforcement makes the response more likely, because the child is more likely to want to do this after a positive response. Does that make sense? The question is, in traditional ABA programs, that's where your teaching is. That's what they teach you to do. You prompt the child, you give an SD, or you want to become an SD, and you prompt the child. Then, when you see the response you want, you reinforce it. But what happens if the child doesn't want to do the response? What happens if they don't want to touch their nose? You say touch your nose, and then you try to prompt them and help them to touch their nose. And they pull their hand away, and they refuse. You never get the behavior of interest. You never get this behavior you want. And if you don't get the behavior you want, you can't possibly reinforce it. So traditional ABA programs got into the habit of forcing unwilling listeners to participate. That's why you see teachers put their legs around a chair to learn, so they can't get away. Or why you might see them put a child into a high chair to learn because they can't escape. Or you might see them physically force a child against their will to touch their nose so they can throw a reinforcer at them and say, ah, gotcha. What we want to understand is that just reinforcement alone is great in that it will increase the behavior that's already occurred. But it doesn't help you get the behavior the first time. It doesn't help you get the behavior at all until you've gotten it a few times and the reinforcement has developed, if the actual reinforcement has occurred. So what do we need to do in order to get the child to touch his nose the first time? Well, that's what the verbal behavior people have looked at and studied in the motivating operation. We want to make sure that there is an antecedent condition, something antecedent that makes the value of our reinforcement so high that it overcomes competing desires. You may know that a child will respond for a tickle. You may respond for a sling on the slings. But in certain situations, those things are not going to work. The value of those reinforcers can become smaller compared to other reinforcement that's available. If you're constantly putting your child in a situation where you're giving him SDs and prompting him, and he has no desire for the behavior itself, no desire to do behavior, your attempts to be able to reinforce him might be stalled. Because he's going to be fighting against this, and so you'll never really get to do the reinforcement you want to do. What a motivating operation is it's a part of the antecedent condition. It's something that's occurring before the behavior that causes the behavior, that causes the reinforcement you're offering to be more valuable in the moment. So a motivating operation changes the value of your reinforcement. It can change it up or it can change it down. Here's an example. I have a glass of water. I have a glass of water, and I would like you to learn to take a drink. That's the skill I would like to see. So I'm assuming that the water itself is the reinforcement. Having the fluid would be the reinforcement. I could also jack it up with some additional reinforcement. If you respond to social reinforcers, I could say, good job, I'm proud of you. If you don't, I might tickle you or do something else that I know acts as reinforcement after this behavior. So now I'm going to take this glass of water. I don't feel comfortable using that as an example, so I'm worried that you guys might not be able to see into that. I'm going to come over here and use you as an example because I know you guys. Let's use you since this is space here. I would like you to take a drink of water, so I'm going to give you the SD. Drink the water. No, seriously, drink the water. Now, the water itself does not change. It still gives you fluid. It still gives you hydration. It can be very hard. She might really want some water. But the fact that she saw me pick the glass, that would be considered an abolishing operation. In the moment, it reduced the value of the water. And if I have abolishing operations in play while I'm teaching, I'm not going to see the response I want, or it's going to be harder for me. I'm going to have to force her to do it. And even though she's getting the water and maybe a tickle afterwards, there's a good chance she's not going to spend any more time with me. I'm going to walk out and say, hey, let's learn. And she's going to say, ooh. Okay? That's an abolishing operation. Sure you don't want something? Now, I have to understand abolishing operations because as teachers, we have them in our antecedent condition all the time. Just being told what to do from another person is an abolishing operation for many children. I have no problem taking out the garbage. But when my wife comes to me and says, take out the garbage, suddenly I don't want to do it anymore. Who will tell me what to do when I do it? I can do it myself. Just the fact that an SD is coming from a specific person can add an abolishing operation to a behavior. We have to understand these abolishing operations as they occur. We also have to understand that there are establishing operations, things that we can do that increase the value of our reinforcement. Now, let's say I didn't lick my glass. Let's use fresh glass over here. Now, I want her to drink water. Right? So I can sit with her at the table and I can say, have a drink of water, I give it to her, she takes a drink, and then I reinforce it with drinks. Okay? That's an intensive trial teaching. She's not drinking water out of the desire for water. She's drinking the water and being reinforced by the tickles. Water, because it's a automatic, what's the word? Because it's a reinforcer, it's an unconditioned reinforcer. We all need water. It's not the best example for this. But let's say it was something that wasn't conditioned. She didn't need water to survive. there's a chance she might not ask for water when she wanted it, because she only learned it under the condition of intensive child teaching. If I wanted to ask for water the first time and say the word water, which might be very hard for her, I want to put her under the strongest motivation for water I can find. So maybe we go outside and we run around for a while. We get really tired, we get thirsty. Then I get out some water, I take a drink, and then I hold the water close to her, but not close enough that she can get it. Now, if she's really thirsty and she's feeling the desire for water, I just created a motivating operation, or an establishing operation, EO, for water. She's going to be more likely to drink the water under my SD in this condition than she would under the condition of me licking the glass. Makes sense, right? Very clear, very easy to understand. A motivating operation makes your reinforcement more valuable. And when you think about it, all we have to use to teach is the reinforcements that work for the child. We don't need to pick our reinforcement for the child. I don't need to say, oh, you're going to like TV. You're going to like balls. All I can do is identify what does work as reinforcement for the child. Once I've identified those things, to some degree I can compare them and make them more reinforcing, and I can take neutral items and I can make them more reinforcing. But that takes time. But if I'm teaching day to day, I only have the reinforcement that's available being worked with. What the motivating operation does is it gives us a way to increase the value of those motivators, making the child more likely to participate to begin with, which then makes us more likely to be able to reinforce, which improves our teaching all the way around. Does this make sense? If your child is motivated to do something or to have something, then they'll be motivated to gain access to it. If you can capture a child's motivation, you can use it to teach. For me, in our programs, we don't think of reinforcers as things. Reinforcers are not things that I have that I can deliver to the child. For me, reinforcement is whatever the child may want to be doing at that time. I would rather you spend time with your child as you're teaching them, identifying what it is they want to be doing. Because whatever it is they want to be doing in that moment, that has an automatic establishing operation, a motivating operation attached to it. It's already strongly motivating. They want to be doing it. That's your reinforcer. Teach under those conditions whenever possible. The first thing we do in our teaching is we don't look at what we want to teach and then look at our reinforcers and decide which one we want to give. We see what the child is interested in. We identify what their interests are in the moment. We bring out options. We start to play. We look for them to engage in something or demonstrate that they want to do something. Then we capture that motivation and then we teach. Now, there's a lot of important establishing operations or motivating operations that you can consider when you're doing your intensive teaching. Ideally, I want to teach children things that they want to learn. Like, for example, if I want to teach a child colors, it's a pretty common skill that children need to learn how to identify their colors. They need to learn receptively. They have to want to it. They need to learn with a tact. They have to say the color when they see it. They have to learn as an interverbal. They have to learn across the board. But let's not going to work on just receptive identification of colors. How do you guys teach this? In a lot of AV programs, you might say, okay, we've identified that chips are a reinforcer for this child, and I have a set of cards with different colors in them. And I say to the child, what color is this? Or I put the cards down on the table and I say, show me green. The child looks, points to green, and I give him a chip. Now, the child is responding because they learned that in your teaching setting, responding to reinforcement. I have to hope that there's a strong motivating operation for that reinforcement. I have to hope they want chips at that point in time. If not, I have to then try to create a motivation for it. That's intensive trial teaching. They're learning this skill for a desire for something else. What's better is if I can teach a skill where the child is desiring the answer. They want this response because this response itself benefits them in the future, and they can see that benefit. I know I'm getting mentalistic in the way I'm describing this, but I have to because I want to make it accessible to everyone to understand. Instead of teaching colors with cars and an outside reinforcer, I'm going to prefer to teach with something like M&Ms. I don't know if you have M&Ms here in Germany. In Germany, they have something called Smarties, which is like M&Ms. Do you guys know what M&Ms are?
Yes.
Little chocolate candies with colored sugar. Now, if I want to teach a child colors, I can spend all day holding up cards or putting cards down and making a point. But if a child is strongly motivated to have an answer and realizes that that answer in the future will be beneficial to them, they're going to hang on to that information better, they're going to work hard, they're going to get better responding. So I might lay down different colored M&Ms. And then I would say to the child, you can have the blue one. Cool. I know he said blue, and I know he said I can have one, but blue has not been discriminated for me yet. What do I do? Well, I might as well guess. No, sorry, that's not blue, you can't have that one. This one? No, that one's not blue, you can't have that one. This one? Yeah, that one's blue. Oh, shoot, I probably better remember what it is. Because next time he says, you can have a blue one, I'm going to go, yeah, that's good, we got it. It's going to be more likely to remember that. I mean, I have a story where there's a parent that I met many years ago who had two children that were diagnosed with autism. She began learning about ABA, PACS, and all different types of approaches to teaching. And when her second child was diagnosed at 18 months, she began using everything she had learned for her first child and really did an intensive program for him right from the beginning. By age 4, he no longer was demonstrating signs of autism. And she was writing on the internet about how she couldn't believe she was throwing away like the old books, the data logs, all the stuff they taught her to do. And she said, did I really take 4 months to teach him what the microwave is? And then in her next sentence, she said something that I thought was really important. She said, actually, now that I think about it, for 4 months I tried to teach him microwave using reinforcement. However, it wasn't until I realized that he loved microwave popcorn. And I started to say, if you like the microwave popcorn, you have to put it in the microwave. And showed him how he could get that into the microwave and make the microwave popcorn. It wasn't until I did that he learned it in 2 days. So it didn't take her 4 months to teach him that one concept. It took her 2 days to teach him that one concept. It took her 3 months and 28 days to figure out how to teach him. That's really important because that's the case with a lot of our kids. It's not that they cannot learn things. It's that we have to figure out how to best teach them that. It's a little tagline on my life hacks on the bottom of all our emails. If you send an email to her, it'll always say at the bottom, If a child can't learn the way we teach, maybe we need to learn how to teach the way that they learn. Something like that. It's important that we understand how to best teach a child, and understanding the motivating operation is crucial to this. So you can teach natural environment teaching by changing your goals to things like M&Ms. But sometimes you can't necessarily do that, and you still have to teach with outside reinforcers. So what do? There's a lot of establishing operations that you can use that still help your teaching. Let's go through a few of these. Number one, mixing and varying your instructional demands. When teaching, try not to present the same demand over and over and over again. When I first got to Germany, there was really only a couple of people who were doing any form of modern EDA. This was back in 2004. Early 2004. There were a few people that were teaching a very old-style, traditional ADA approach that they had learned from the 70s Logos interview and tried to develop on their own. And I saw a video of them, and they were recommending that you only use the same reinforcement for teaching. So don't ever let them have pretzels, and pretzels to be your main reinforcement for teaching. And so the child would come, he would sit down, and that's when he would get his pretzels, or whatever it was that was his favorite food item. They also would do blocks of skills 10 times. Cut the paper, good job. Here's your pretzel. Okay, cut the paper, good job. Here's your pretzel. Cut the paper, good job. And I was watching videos of these kids, and here's how they responded. By the time they got to the fifth or sixth one, they were almost asleep. Or they had the scissors in their hand and they were looking to cut anything they could cut with. What else can I cut? The reinforcement has to be reinforcing for the function. And the better the motivating operation, the better attention you'll get, the better effort you'll get, the better posture you'll see. The faster you're responding, the more loud the vocal will be. These are all signs that your teaching is good. It's also signs that you're working under a strong motivating operation. If your child is sitting back in his chair, you're not working right. Forget that. Some of you are happy that your child is sitting back in his chair, because at least he's not getting out of his chair. But for me, that's not good enough. Yes, I want him to want to get in the chair. I want to be in. In fact, in our programs, we don't consider ourselves at optimal teaching if we don't get to the point where the child, when the teacher comes into the room, the child runs over and grabs the teaching materials and runs up to them. Okay, let's go. What's next? What do we do? Because that's why we have optimal. Until I have that motivation, a motivated learner, I'm never going to get anywhere near the level of outcome that I could achieve. So we want to mix and vary our instructional demands. We want to go back and forth between all the different skills we're teaching. We don't want anything to become rote. We don't want anything to become boring. We don't want anything to make little sense. It's got a lot of benefits. One, it increases the value of your reinforcement. If what you're doing is interesting and it's constantly changing, you're more likely to be willing to go to work for the same amount of money. You're more likely to be sick less. You're more likely to focus in on your work. It's interesting and different to changes. Also, it benefits our kids on the playground. If you only teach a child through mash trials and then hope later someday be able to mix and vary, once the child's on the playground, they're not having any experience responding to a mixed and varied world, which is what we live in. No one's going to walk up to your child on the playground and say, what color is your shirt? What color are your pants? What color are your shoes? What color is my shirt? It doesn't matter. They say, hey, what's your name? You want to play? Where'd you get that shirt? What color is that? Let's go and play soccer. And if your child is not able to quickly respond to all of these different SEs coming from different sides, they're not going to be a functioning communicator in the real world. So it makes sense to start with this right from the beginning. A good early behavior approach generally works in mixed and varied instructions from as early as possible. There may be some match trials on some difficult tasks, but as quickly as possible, we're going to be mixing back and forth across all the different skills, and we're going to want to mix back and forth across the different functions of language. First, we're going to do an echo, then we're going to do a motor imitation, then we're going to do a man, then we're going to get into a tact. We're going to want to go back and forth among all of those things. Another thing that's important as a key element, something else that can increase the value of the reinforcers you have, is interspersing easy and hard demands. You don't want to sit down with your child and just give them their difficult learning tasks over and over. Even if you're mixing back and forth, you can't mix from new acquisition skill to new acquisition skill to new acquisition skill. Because the difficulty level will become so high that the reinforcement offering will shrink in value. What you have to do is mix back and forth between easy and hard skills. We generally recommend about 80% of our skills be easy, simple. Things like give me 5, touch your nose, do this. Mixed in with more difficult skills like what color is this? Because what color is challenging. And as soon as you give that SE, the value of your reinforcement is going to shrink. And if you keep giving those difficult SEs, you shrink more and more until what happens? Escape. But if I can give an SE that's difficult, but then follow with 2 or 3 easy ones and still reinforce those easy ones, the value, the difficulty level of my teaching stays in the middle here, which keeps better cooperation, keeps better access to the child. He's not leaving me as much. He wants to be there. It's an important establishing operation that you can use in your teaching. Another thing you can do as an establishing operation is keep your inter-trial intervals. That means keep the time between one instruction and the next very short. If I want to be on a variable ratio, which we're going to talk about next, meaning if I'm going to ask for 2 or 3 or 4 instructions before I reinforce, I want to do as quickly as possible. I don't want to get into long, flowery language. Boy, it sure would be nice if you were to come over here and touch your nose. That was awesome. Way to go. Now let's see. How about if you say the word ah? First of all, a lot of that language isn't necessarily part of the ST and it's confusing. But secondly, what I know about learning is this. Children want reinforcement just like we do. Everything you do is based upon reinforcement. You're sitting in this room because you feel that there is some form of reinforcement available to you. You can reinforce by coming to these type of presentations in the past. So therefore you're here. You're only here for that reason. If you thought I was going to come here and paint the walls today, there's not a good chance that you would be sitting in this room, correct? Our kids are the exact same way. They only going to be working for reinforcement. When I think of teaching, I try to think of the reinforcement aspect of it as like being in the pool, and you're floating in the water, and you're splashing, and you're playing, and you're throwing the ball, diving in, and you're doing all the fun stuff. That's the reinforcement. Preparing yourself for reinforcement. That's what we're doing. That's teaching. However, in that period of time, you're going to have to present SEs. You're going to have to look for the right response so that you can continue to reinforce it. Well, for me, giving the instruction and waiting for the answer, that's like taking a child's hand and putting it under the water. You're taking all the fun out of the situation, you're putting them under the water, and you're holding them there until you reinforce again. What I want to make sure is that I'm giving them their instructions as quickly as possible, I'm going to want to give them every opportunity to answer as quickly as possible. And I'm going to get back to the reinforcement fund as soon as possible. If I am expecting a child to sit with me for 2 hours, I should be willing to make sure that that 2 hours is as motivating and as fun-filled as possible, and I have to. If I spend more time through the teaching process and less time during the reinforcement, I get nothing but fail. The next we want to talk about is variable ratio reinforcement. It's in the beginning. I'm going to talk about this when I get to instructional control later. But in the beginning, you want to be reinforcing every good response you can, because you want to set up that contingency that, hey, I'll give you instruction, but if you do something, you'll get something. And life will be worth it to look for my instructions enough, to look for them to respond, because you generally will get something. Over time, though, we can't reinforce each and every response. So we start to reinforce every several responses. It's important that we do that very early. I don't want a child to ever know exactly what reinforcement is going to come. I don't want them to work for a specific reinforcement. I don't want to reinforce with one item, try to know it's there, and always think it's that. What I want to reinforce with is lots of reinforcement things, and I want to always be surprised. I don't want the child to work for a thing, because then you get in a situation where they start negotiating with you. Oh no, I don't want to work for that, I'll work for that. Or you want to give me a chocolate? I want 2 chocolates, so then I'll do it. We don't want to deal with that at all. So that often happens when you're, now having the reinforced or available can be a motivated operation. But you have to be careful. We don't want the child to work just for that. We also don't want them to know when the reinforcer is coming. If you're going to be working 4, 5, 6 responses before I reinforce you, I don't want it to be every 5th one. If it's every 5th one, studies have shown that you won't respond very well on the first 3, maybe the first 4. And then you'll pay attention and sit forward on that last one when you know it's coming. So the reinforcement has to be a surprise when it comes. And it often should be a surprise as to what it is. I may be sitting here with M&Ms, but if I see you do a really great thing, I might want to pick you up and swing you around and tickle you as well. I want you to know that reinforcement is going to come. You just don't know what it is and when it is, but that if you just trust me and stay with me, good things will come regularly enough that it will be working for you. We want to increase variable ratio over time. I have a little video here. This is us beginning teaching with TV as a reinforcement. And for this, oops, I probably should have shown you this. Yeah, increasing variable ratio. This is a really Josephine. She was, I think, about 8 at the time. Can you guys see that? Can we turn the lights on a little bit here, maybe? Now, Josephine, I think, was 8 when we started working with her. This is our initial consultation. Her strongest reinforcer was the TV. It's something she did almost all day, every day. She would scream and yell as soon as the TV got turned off. So her family just left it on most of the day because otherwise she was upset. She also had a pacifier. I don't know what it's called here in Jersey, they probably should. They had a pacifier that she would wear almost all day. And they would take it away from her at dinner 2 times and try to hide it. And then she would, when she started getting angry enough and wanted that, they would give it back to her and they would try to take it away from her and she'd go to sleep. She didn't respond to anything. She wouldn't answer questions, although she could imitate all the language on the TV. Questions, they couldn't get any kind of real responding from her. What we did is we sat down with her and we started to just pair ourselves with the TV. We let her know that sitting with us meant the TV would be available. If you got up, we would turn the TV off. And you could scream and cry and run and hit. It didn't matter what you did, but as soon as you came near us again, or you sat down with us, we would turn the TV back on. And very quickly, she learned that being together with my wife Nadine was the best place to be in the house, because that's when TV would come on. So very quickly, we paired ourselves, or I paired my wife, with the TV. And then we started to ask for simple responses. Do this, or do this. In the beginning, she wasn't responding because she had no experience with responding to invitation. But through prompting and through a strong motivating operation, strong desire to watch the TV, and then repeated repetition, you start to see her being willing to follow these more advanced instructions. I can't remember if this takes place. I think this takes place over 2 days. Day 1, and then the second day we're working with the family again. It starts out with my wife, and then the family, the parents take over and start doing it as they're learning how. And this is what it looks like to go from consistent reinforcement to a variable ratio of reinforcement. Now we can get 2, 3, 4 responses. We were able to do it in just 2 days. So every time she follows an instruction, she gives it back. Did you notice that? My wife moves away from her, and without even really giving an instruction, she immediately, when the TV turned off, she looked for Nadine and went and sat next to her. We paired being with Nadine with reinforcement, making being with Nadine valuable. There was value in being with her. So she didn't even have to give that instruction anymore. As soon as the TV was off, she wanted to be like Nadine. Now, what we're teaching her is there's value in following an instruction. Pretty soon what will happen is as soon as the TV turns off, she looks for an instruction. What do you want me to do? That's that step. And then ultimately, we're going to start asking for 2 or 3 things before we turn the TV back on. That's how we got without a promise. We snuck in a second instruction. The first instruction was come here, the second instruction was do this. So we got 2 instructions in that time. And that's kind of the process. You slowly start to sneak in the extra instructions. Also, because we were starting to get the clapping without prompts, it was already time to start switching to a new skill within that. Because we didn't want to just teach her that clapping her hands was the response to do this. But that doing what we did is the response to do this. Now we're looking for better. Now we're looking for the quiet. That's actually echoing instruction as well as leading. Is she wearing the same shirt? No, okay, so it's the second day. So now we're at the second day. We're working with the family, and we want mom and dad to do what we do, which is do this, come here, some simple instructions. And dad, out of the blue, picks up a banana and says, "What is this?" And we have no expectation that she's going to respond to that. We know she can echo banana, but we've never heard her say it on a banana before. And surprisingly, she responds, "Apple," which we're like, oh, okay, so she's responding for the first time to a question. And dad says, "What is this?" And she says, "Apple," which is interesting because she's eating an apple. So we don't know if she's responding because of the apple in her hand versus the banana. But when he doesn't respond with reinforcement for apple, she changes her response. She says banana, TV is turned on. It's a really important teaching moment. Now we got two good, strong responses. Now look at 3 and 4 responses, and even getting her to give up her pacifier. It gets to the point where we don't even have to ask for the pacifier anymore. As soon as she turns off the TV, starts to reach out her hand, she's already giving it to her. Because she knows that in order to get the TV back on, this is the process. We're using the motivating operation, we're using mixing and varying of skills. We're going to use a mix of easy and hard skills, but right now all of these are a mixture because they're hard because she's never done them before, but they're generally not hard for her to perform, understand. And you see her responding 3 and 4 in order to reinforce. Okay. I should probably take some time to look at the questions before I try to answer them, so let's continue with this for now. Another important, again, the last back up, please. Another important motivating operation that you should keep in control is the use of errorless learning. How many of you are familiar with errorless learning? Okay. Again, somewhere in between, probably about 15% of you. If you look at traditional style ABA programs, especially things that are low-cost based, you see a lot of no-no prompting, where you give the child an opportunity with a new SD or with one that you expect them to answer. If they're incorrect, you then say no, or you do not reinforce, and then you repeat it again. And then ultimately you would then give your prompt to help them. One thing we know about motivation is that being incorrect, not being reinforcement, is an abolishing operation for the teaching setting in general. What we want to see is kids being correct as often as possible. Why is that? As soon as you give me the behavior that you're correct in, I can reinforce it. And until I reinforce, that behavior is not going to increase. So I want consistent, positive responding to be met with reinforcement. So I'm going to use errorless learning for a lot of our skills, especially early on. I'm going to try to not allow the child to be incorrect. I'm going to start by giving my instruction with as much prompt as necessary to get that response that I want. Remember, when your child doesn't want to touch his nose, and you can't reinforce it, the old approach in ABA was to force him to touch his nose, or don't let him leave and keep nagging him until he does. Well, we don't want to work that way. I want the child to be put in a motivating situation where he's going to want to touch his nose. That way I can reinforce it. Everything I'm going to teach you in the afternoon session or in the next session here about instructional control will go back to the awareness. How do we get the child to want to participate in our teaching? To desire more interaction with us? To try to convince us to teach them? Because until you have that, you're not optimal. Until you have that, your ABA program is okay or good, but it's not great. So errorless learning helps us with this by using prompts for our SDs, and then over time, with reinforcement, fading back those prompts until we get independence. If a child's going to be wrong several times before they get reinforcement, they're going to be more likely to get frustrated and to leave. If they're right the first time you introduce a new skill, and then they get reinforced, and then they're right the second time, and then they're right the third time, and now you make it a little bit more difficult, but they're still able to get it right and still get reinforced, which child's going to be happier in the teaching setting? Which child's going to be more likely to smile when you come walking into the room? So we're going to want to use errorless learning, using SDs as prompts as much as necessary. We're going to try to keep the number of errors down so that we keep the amount of reinforcement high. And this works as a motivating operation because it keeps the reinforcement level more valuable. Okay, I showed a video here. This is a little boy learning how to sort items for the first time. Not only do I want to use errorless learning, but I also want to break down the skills that we teach to the easiest level possible so that we can get better success. And then make them more complicated as we go, build upon them as we go. So, I'm sorry to do this to you, but I need the lights off again for the video. Okay, so this boy is going to be learning how to sort. And I'm just going to give the SD to sort because I want him to become familiar with what that means. So I'm placing it in the antecedent. I'm offering prompts in the form of full physical prompts or gestural prompts as to how to be successful. And then when I get the response I'm looking for, I reinforce. And with subsequent trials, you'll see me start to pull back some of my prompting, and you'll see him hopefully continue to be successful. If he makes a mistake, to some degree, that's my mistake, because I pulled back my prompts too quickly. I didn't give him the transition time before spacing needed. I didn't make the connection I wanted to make yet. So I have to then fix that myself. This type of a skill might be one of the few times you'll see us do match trials. Here you see me do it over and over again because the skill itself is a match trial. Sorting, it requires doing something over and over again. It was pretty hard for him to not get that correct. I made it as simple as possible. I gave him the SD, I made sure he did it correctly, and I was able to reinforce it. Now we're also working on manning for music at the same time, which is why you see a delay in the reinforcement. So now we're going to change it up a little bit, switch it so he knows that it's not always spoons here. I made a mistake there. I had been giving only one item. I had to switch back and forth. So when I switched to the other one, I should have known he was going to just follow through, because that's what he was getting reinforced for. So as I gave him the new item, I should have already been guiding him to the correct answer, so I could reinforce it. But instead, he made a mistake, so now I have to go through a confusion here in order to get it fixed. Now, when I go to school, I gotta make sure he does it good. That's progress, he's fixing himself. So after about 3 trials or so, he was able to then put the right items in the right area. Now the skill's not mastered by any means. He's only able to he's only able to, did we do something here? He's only able to respond with the ball and the spoons in that one setting. The next step is to teach him to do it with different items, then to do it with 3 items, then to do it with all the items in front of you, separating them, then to do it in a natural environment, teaching with spoons and forks and cloves and things that you would normally use. But this is the first process of teaching him the idea and concept of sorting. And by using airless learning, we kept him positive and kept him involved by being able to reinforce consistently. How much time do I have? How are we doing time? How long? Alright, let me show one more video and then we'll do a break. And it's not a half break, it's a break in the first session. Or is it? It's been 2 hours, okay? Then I'm not going to show another video. I'm going to do this real quick and then we'll finish up. Okay? So, let's talk about discrete trial teaching. I'm assuming most of you are familiar with the process of discrete trial teaching. It's the base teaching method by everything we do in ABA. And the way that I was always taught discrete trial teaching goes like this. Number one, first thing you do is you present the ST to the child at a time when the child is attending. Number two, when necessary, you offer a prompt to the ST. What is it? Water is the prompt. That's all part of the answer condition. The next step is to identify the child's best response. What is that expected response that you're looking to reinforce? Once you identify it, you then go over to the consequence and you reinforce that, preferably with positive reinforcement when you're correct. And then the final step is to record your data, to keep track of how well you got the child. How you keep data depends upon your approach. Verbal behavior approach tends to do more pro data, where you take data in the morning session and then teach about the data later, and then take it again in the next morning session, and then see how they do from morning to morning. That way we don't have to lose our connection to the child throughout the entire day. But to me, this is where I was always taught discrete trial teaching. Is this how you guys have been taught discrete trial teaching for the most part? Is that the SB? Okay. I'll tell you right now that thanks to verbal behavior, I no longer consider this appropriate. This is a weak form of discrete trial teaching, as far as I'm concerned. What I need to do is I need to have number one. Before I teach anything to anyone, I have to first capture or create a motivator, a motivation. Your antecedent condition is not SD prompt. That's not enough. Because you can have an SD and a prompt all day long and you will not respond to certain things. Let's say I have, look at you, some of you have water right now sitting in front of you. The water is the SD. The water right there tells you, hey, hydration is available to me. I can give you a prompt. I can say, feel free to have some water if you want, it won't bother me. But you're not picking up your water and drinking it right now. Why? You would be doing it all the time, wouldn't you? There's no MO. There's no motivating operation that makes the water valuable enough to overcome your other desires. Listening to me, thinking about what you just said, watching the video. You need to have all three things in place to be successful. There needs to be an SE, an MO, and sometimes necessarily a prompt as well. If you're working without knowing about those things, you're going to be in trouble. You can't work without SEs, and you shouldn't work without understanding MOs. That's something the verbal behavior approach prioritizes in the way that we teach. Everything we do is geared around what is our MO, how do we work with our MO, how do we make sure that there's going to be a motivating operation with our SE. We always start this way. If I'm working with a family and I say to the mom, show me how you teach receptive identification. And the mom, first thing she does is she tells the child to sit down and delivers an SD. Wrong. Wrong. You're never going to have optimal learning in that. First thing you have to do is engage with the child. You get to pair with something that could be reinforcing. Identify that there's a motivation in the child to achieve or to have something. Start to play a tickle with them, and then when you know they want more tickles, then, and only then, do you give your first instruction. I'm only going to give my instruction when I know that that child wants something from me in that moment. Because if I give instruction any other time, there's less likelihood that it's going to be responded to. That motivated operation is extremely important. Can I finish with one thing? And then we'll take a break. Okay, this is teaching the echoic to a boy named Daniel. He's 16 years old, the first day we meet him. This is the first day I meet him. Oops, I asked the family, what is it that we want to do? What is it that he likes to do? And they say, well, he likes to play with cards, he likes to play with these games, and we tried everything that he liked. And not a single thing he liked worked as far as getting him interested in more playing with me. Here it is. It wasn't until I started to, he leaned into me once and I kind of gave him a shove and he laughed. He went, hey! I was like, oh, hey, that's something positive. That was the first laugh I got him. So I pushed him again. He went, ah! He leaned into me. I was like, okay, that's cool. He likes this. So I punched him. And he went, ah! And then he leaned into me again. And I was like, wow, okay, so I got something. The cards he told him he liked didn't work. Anything I tried to do with him showed no interest. But as soon as I started beating him up, he started laughing at me. Well, there you go. Now I've got a situation I can teach him. I've got something he wants from me, I can now teach. In fact, at one point, he grabbed me by the hand and ran into his room. He threw himself down on his bed, which is actually a mattress on the floor underneath a bunk bed type thing. And then he grabbed me and threw me on top of him. So I started pushing out like, I like this. So that's when I started to teach. And I started to teach the first echoes. He's never responded to anything his entire life. He's never echoed anything his entire life. He makes sounds, but his sounds are not under the control of other people's sounds. I could say things, say ah, and he would never say it. Say ma, and he would never say it. At 16 years old, I sit with him and start to use his motivation. I identify a strong motivator, and then I start to present the SDs. And suddenly I start to get responding that they've never seen before. Now, because I was getting the E's and the A's pretty easily, I started to change to a more advanced skill, and I tried Ba. What he does here is he says Ma. Now that's not Ba, but it's close, so I reinforced it because it's in the right direction. Now I'm starting to shape the sounds. Now I started to say ba again, and then immediately I realized, oh wait a second, he said ma last time. Well, that makes more sense. Let me use ma as an ST because I've already got it. Now, let me say this. I've been working in this field for, I don't know, about 12 years now, 14 years if you consider before becoming a BCBA. I did not wake up that morning and expect to spend my day in bed with a 16-year-old boy. Wasn't my goal for the day. But ultimately, if I would have taken the time to figure out what motivated him and been willing to use that prior to trying to teach him, I never would have made a connection with him where he was willing to learn from me. Now we're working on two things here. We're working on the echoic and also some man requesting for music. Looking at me forward, watching my face, concentrating, trying to respond quickly, that's a motivated learner. Without that, you're not teaching them. Again, this is now day 2, the second day of the first time we met this boy. We started to find other things that were motivating for him, and the screen was one of them. You hear that? I went back to the ba. I haven't gotten the ba all day yesterday, I hadn't gotten one yet this morning, but because he was extremely motivated at the moment, I went back and tried my ba. We're about to see his first ever ba, and we're both pretty excited about it. Now, he does something that some children will do, is he tries to communicate with you while you say it, and you don't want to do that. You want to fight against that. You want to say, Mama, stop, and then he responds. Because as it becomes more difficult, the skills become more difficult, he needs to be able to watch and see and listen to everything you do first, and then respond. So be careful about that. So in this case, we got the child to echo his first sounds on the first day. We got to echo his first word, Mama, on the second day, at 16 years old. He didn't need 16 years to be able to do this, or to go from there, to go from there. He needed 2 days to learn how to do it. But he needed 2 days of motivated teaching. Motivated learning through good teaching. We had to make sure that we had a strong motivating operation in play. We had to know the different functions of language. And focusing in on the echoic, we were able to get his first word at age 16. I've worked with people of all different ages who were completely nonverbal, who we've been able to, through motivation and reinforcement, start them on the process of becoming vocal, being able to use sounds, words, multiple words, even to becoming conversational. But for a lot of those children, their learning didn't start until someone started applying applied behavior analysis to their daily lives. And for some of these children, even the verbal behavior approach was a necessity for them to be able to start making that adjustment. Okay, it's break time? Yeah? The second half of my speech is going to have more videos, so if you're more interested in that,
Aveam o oră de masă inițial la 8:20, dacă nu am știut când mă dau la ora de zi, o știu, dar să vin în toată de sală, cum să la 2 ore, de ce n-aș vrea să spun că nu e timp pe care l-am dat. Dar nu fac de ședință de masă, că aveam 25 de minute. Dar poate că la masă 20 de 5, la masă 20, nu?
This is my sweater. So Am făcut la
Știam cum e dacă e la sau mai. Iar le știu, eu știu dacă actorii noștri. Da. Deci ca și să dacă Facebook. Da, exact. Era să ia gata la eu oricum îmi dau veche. Da? Eu pentru că nu, dar fac pe și că nu mai ești sub ea. Și dacă am un ușor, nu se vede, știi? Și veche oricum la asta. Da, mare chestia acum așa că da, eu am Păi ai la frente ceva pe așa cum sunt ba da, două zile, nu știu. Ia e. Și am banane și nu? Pe cuvântul tău. Ia să te uitați. Sau ce că chiar țin să mă uitați. Mai greu cum este. Dar știi că e o experiență. Nu, în sensul că eu nu pot să fac așa ceva cu ea. Gustă una să vă spune. Gustă una. Să se mai ca dimineață. Păi da, aia. Da, pe care n-ar fi auzită de apucat și veni cu sticla. Ți-am zis să uit, ne-am dat seama de a trecut. De gândire ce nu te să mă rog să da, eu am să zic, de ce nu te zic? Așa trebuie să te iei. Da, mă, că faci apahar, dar se mișcă aici, nu știu ce să fac. Gata? Ce mai deșați m-am am văzut să la mine am mâncat. Sper că la Adică și am zis, dar nu vedem monitorul de tot. Sau și de copii. E orice, care să fie ce vrei, nu mai să scriu codele și de-aia. E asta de iulie. De fapt, nu de iulie, că n-am făcut de iulie. Eu uite, să se vrea să fie să fie. Deci, îmi plac pe de mine, până la sensia. Deci, nu îmi vinge mai merea. Și știam de cum de nimic, dar nu mai știu. Dar mă uitam, nu fi și... pentru că acolo...
Bă, dar... Dar fan de la ceea ce am
Ai grijă cu el.
Dar nu știu, vă mai aștepta să mai...
Nu, dar eram curioasă că pe aici, ca să nu mă uit la el, că vine la mine de poveste.
Da. Pe ultima oară când am zis și am zis că nu am uitat. Ți-ai cam mai bine.
Câți ani toate? Știu că mai mult de 2 ani. Să vină la tine să zică că nu v-am uitat. Mă rog, să ne mai deschidem.
Mai mult.
Mai mult de 2 ani. Dacă asta, mai mult. Adică nu vorba terapia copilului. Ce faci acum? Ce crede de mine? Băi, tu să te simți bine cu tine.
Da.
Bine că nu te-ai uitat. Da, să te gândești la asta. Nu era noi.
Să mă duc telefonul pe mine pe aici.
Nu vezi și eu astăzi. Mai este la...
Nu ți-ai auzit? Așa.
Vrei să nu te oprești în asta, te rog.
La mine.
Dar nu, asta ce-am la mine, îi reprobez să le-am de aici.
Măcar am mușcat din ele, să știu.
Da, ține de aia de la băgăță cu scrășmeată din că dacă ales mașină. Dacă ai băgat în gură, ia-ți aviu. Le toacă, știi cum le scoate.
Noi suntem Irina, ce s-a lăsat?
Sau Bianca și la 2 e Jonathan și Daniela. Și eu sunt la 2 și eu, da, și
Păi după tine l-am răspuns.
și de la 4
Bianca, noi le avem.
eu la ea am
La 4 suntem la urmărește.
Nu mai știi?
La 4 la ce s-a născut? 2?
Nu cred că mai stau la 4. La 1 ar trebui.
Nu la ce oră?
Nu știu, dar căpița mea zic că foarte mare. Nu știu, mă duc la 6. Dar nu mai primim. Nu fac să fac nici. Nu știu ce să fac. Nu ce are de bine. Nu am o singur. E un mod.
De la 4 e Adriana Piscop și Iulia Stoian, sau Andreea și Ioana.
Andreea Mătoan.
Da.
La 1.
Și la 1 e Adriana și
Mai... Da.
De la 1
cât
nu.
vreți. Mai mult pentru Iulia. Puteți să vă... Ca și cu ei stați. Că, așa o să rămân și fetele, nu știu dacă s-au înscris. Zic, la noi. Natalia, Andra, nu s-au înscris.
Ca și Florentina, Natalia?
Întrebătoare, așa.
Bine mi-am sagt. Cine e?
Cine-o fi, mă?
Cine mai și asta?
Aude, ai răspuns prea repede, trebuia să luați faci.
Nu.
Nu că...
Cine știe ce urma?
Ai văzut pe Pușcașul, văzut Pușcașul, m-am gândit la băiatul ăla. Ai frate?
Da, dar nu-i băiat, e bărbat.
E pe bărbat.
Mai bărbat.
Lucrează unde?
Instalator.
Ah,
Era bine. Nu, de la sală. La context. Unde? Dar nu.
E căsătorit și el, așa cum știu.
Serios?
Da.
e și serios? Uite la sală, la sală la Florin, nu? Ăla era aici.
A fost prea frig ieri.
N-am prins este.
Ce faceți că a luat Cristina Cechi?
N-am dat.
Fără tine, te rog să ne comentezi. Oli, comentați-ne.
Nu vrei să-ți comentezi.
Și
Și stai gândește 2 ore înainte să mă
Comentează-ne, Oli, să ne
eu zic să nu. Să nu ne rău.
Vero?
ia și tu.
Nu ne rău.
E rău, ia și tu.
Da, dar sunt spuse de mare. Deci rău.
Da, din cauza că
Comentează-ne, Oli.
vezi, eu am zis să mă...
Stai așa pe pauză.
Care nu ne-a păstrat 9 locuri la locuri. Aha.
Eu?
Da.
Ce cu mine? Ai fost?
Pe eu, da, fetele astea.
Ce mi-ai zis?
Glumesc.
Un pic mai față. Trebuia să vii și să zici că au fost cu lista.
Ele trebuia să le dați.
Ha?
Ele trebuia să le dați.
Tu le sunai, le spuneai care cum sunt.
Dar n-am știut că era bună.
Nici noi. Până când am început să scriem, știi? 2 ore, deja erau 60. Lista mea cel puțin. E ca și voi.
Păi de la 60 trebuia să zici, nu mai sunt locuri. Și după ce veneam noi, ne înscriam, nu ne înscriam, apoi ziceai, haideți că fetele astea n-au vrut. Băgăm și doamna voi toți.
Irina. Hai, vrei să te știi.
De ce te-ai dus în spate? Hai, că am înțeles de ele. Voi v-ați făcut să ia mine.
Ca să ne ajute și mine.
De tine ne uităm la ce poți să știi.
Da, două și Dar cu ce stai acolo? Nu știu, ce e acolo? Oricum mă stăteam de locurile de față. Mama, era bună. Cine e așa, Oli? Asta e scopul. Și ce? Da, mă miră. Păi, eu nu vorbesc. Doamne, de ce n-ai sigur să deschide banana? Zic, mă mir că n-ai mări. Deci, ceva mult. Sigur? Da? Frice? Să mă duc hai, doamne. Stimabile. Ca așa, cred că faceți parte din eu m-am întâlnit cu altă directoare și cu altă management organizatoare, am fost dată flori și așa rămas, știi? De aici încep să mă ocup să se găsească pixel de bază și zic că da, se potrivește data. Fai o poză cu așa. Nu mă faci să ai fama și nu plătești. Să nu plătești. Wow! Ce faci că ești cam lasă-mă în pace că eram aici. Făceam aici în parc, plecam de la conferință. Știi pe Jojoza? Da, cumva, dar si. Da, să fiți ca așa până. Da. Control instrucțional. Asta Tchaikovsky, asta ai zis?
Mi-aș pune un semn de întrebare.
Poți să vă fim și video pentru ce văzăști astea.
Da, e posibil să...
Cel puțin în ce faci? Thank you.
Welcome back, everyone. Hope you enjoyed your little break. But we are getting back to it. I have a lot that I'd like to cover, so we'll get started right away. Is the translation working good now? Yes, no? I've been given a few questions I'm going to answer to start with. First is about my book. Is motivation and reinforcement going to be translated into Romanian? And the answer to that is I don't know. I cannot recall. I think someone had asked me about it, but I don't have any definite plans at this point. If there's someone who is connected to a publisher and would like to get involved in translating it, my only concern is that the translation has to be appropriate. It has to be looked at by BCBA, someone who can then make sure that the translation is exactly what we're looking for as appropriate. But I'm more than happy to get involved in that. If someone is interested, you can give them a card, and you can send me an email and we'll talk about it. Also, someone asked about where to get the book. If you look right here, I have a website that you can do it. You can look through the book just by Googling it. You usually find it in any of your major bookstore online sites. But this is where you get it the cheapest. It's lulu.com. And then you can just put my name in it, or you can put /spotlight/trend. And that's where you find it. Again, all the topics that I talked about today will be discussed in the book. In fact, this book is 400 pages, over 400 pages long, and what I wrote in there is pretty much everything that I would want someone to tell me if I was a parent or a teacher of a child with autism or a similar related disability, and I wanted to know how to best help my child. Everything that I would want to know, I wish someone would tell me I'd put it in that book. So, it was originally written in 2006, it was updated again in 2011. I'm also currently working on a new book called 7 Steps to Earning Instructional Control. And this is just very specifically talking about the topic we're going to have next. This book is due out in May. I'm hoping to have it in time for the ADA International Conference in Chicago. I didn't give you much background on myself. I am an American who is married to a German, and my wife and I met in California, and we moved to Germany in 2004. We have an institute there called Universitatea, and we serve over 350 children throughout Germany and some of the surrounding countries. We don't have a clinic. We're not center-based. We work in the homes and the schools of the children that come to us. We're currently working towards earning instructional control and supporting educations. In most of our cases, well over 90%, we're doing it using the techniques that I'm going to be talking about now, called the 7 Steps to Earning Instructional Control. We do that without using these procedures, which are very common in traditional ADA programs. It's very common when you're working in ADA to feel the need to block your child from attempting to escape the teaching setting. You give him an instruction, he tries to get up and walk away, so you grab his arm, or you block him in and hold him in. We try to work without ever using that. We also try to work without forced physically prompting a child to complete a task. I will physically help a child to do the task. But if he pulls away, I will release and I will not try to force him to do it. We also will work generally without paced prompting, or what's also known as the nagging procedure, which is an escape extinction procedure where you continue to repeat the instruction over and over and over and over, so the child feels there's no escape. I have to answer or else I'll be able to escape. We earn our instructional control without this. So to start, what is instructional control? Well, instructional control deals with the likelihood that the presented instructions will lead to the desired response. Is this microphone too loud right now? Okay, it feels a little loud. The likelihood that the presented instructions will lead to the desired response. So, if you ask your child to put on shoes, or to come here, or to say ah, what is the likelihood that he will respond appropriately to that instruction? Many of the children we begin working with are responding to sometimes less than 5% of the daily instructions that are given to them. When that's the case, you can say that the child does not have very good instructional control, or more appropriately, the instructions do not control that child's behavior the way that they should. Typical children tend to have 70 to 80% instructional control. Somewhere around 70 to 80% of the time they'll do what they're asked. And they'll try their best to do what they're asked. No one does everything. And I wouldn't want your child with autism to do everything else. But I would like to have 60, 70, 80% of my instructions to follow if I want to see a child meeting their abilities. The more likely an instruction leads to the intended response, the better the instructional control. So that's what we're going to be working on, trying to do a process of earning instructional control. Now, I'm going to teach you a seven-step process that I wrote, that I created, based on the literature, based on the APA literature. Nothing in these 7 steps is brand new or revolutionary in and of itself. But putting them together the way that I did offers you an easily taught and easily reproduced way of earning instructional control with almost any learner. So we're going to go through those 7 steps with you today. Before we do, I'd like to start with just a video example. This is a boy named Anton who was, I want to say 4 or 5 when we met him. This is our first day meeting him. He was very difficult. When he first arrived, he cried for the first hour just because there were people in his house. And he didn't want anyone there stealing away mom's attention or forcing him to do anything he didn't want. His favorite food to eat is the hanuta. I don't know if you have hanuta here. Yeah? It's like a candy cookie bar. And so I asked the family, I said, what's his favorite food item? Because I want to see if we can get him to participate in some things. And they said, oh, he loves the hanuta. He'll do any, hanuta is his favorite. I said, okay, great, let's get him hanuta. She gave it to me, and I cracked it. And as I was cracking it, he saw it, Mom went, what is that? I thought he said it's just his favorite. She said, yeah, but now that you broke it, you will need it. You'll only eat it if it's a full hanuta. I said, well, that doesn't make any sense. It's his favorite thing. He won't eat it because it's not full. Well, he's learned through years that he can control his environment. And that making demands on his environment and then following those demands with inappropriate behavior is able to manipulate it pretty much wherever he wants, the way he wants it. And to some degree, fighting for things the way he has them now is more valuable to him than accepting new ideas. Because when I start to give him new things, then the expectation is that that's going to grow. And that's hard for him. So when I wrote the hanuta, he very quickly said, nope, not interested, don't want it at all. Breaking the hanuta was an abolishing operation for the behavior of eating the hanuta. Right? So what I had to do was I had to start putting in some motivating operations into my antecedent condition. And so in this case, he started to show interest in the flips, which we call Cheetos in America. I'm not sure where that's here. He wanted to eat those. So we said, okay, no problem, you can eat those. But just like we did with Josephine, the girl with the TV, for him, we weren't going to give reinforcement unless he came and sat down at the table with us. And then we weren't going to continue to give reinforcement to him unless he was quiet, and then eventually started following simple instructions like do this. Okay? This is the first attempt to get him to sit for the first time. And my wife is going to be engaging in the 7 steps to instructional control and how she tries to do that. Oh, I didn't have to do that. This video is in Now, when he's standing, when he's sitting, when he's crying, food is followed away. When he's sitting quietly, he comes back closer and he gets access to it. He starts to scream, and we pull back away. My wife is making the choice to remove him from the teaching center to see how he responds. Does he come back to us? Does he stay there? In this case, he threatens the big screen TV. We block the TV without giving any attention. and he runs for food. He has lots of words he can use, but he never says anything when someone tells him to. But when he sits, he gets access. Notice no one is holding him in the chair. He's free to go anywhere he wants. And that's an important part of the 7 steps. The more out of control his behavior, the less we help him, and the farther away the fruits become. Now he's calling for his community and the verbal ones. Now, 20 minutes before, he wouldn't touch these. What he's trying to do is anything he can think of to get his reinforcement without following our instruction. He's sitting to sit. Now he's sitting, he's quiet, so he gets a reinforcement. Now he's going to ask for another one. And my wife's going to give instructions. Now, that was the process for instructional control. Here we come back 2 months later. Now our mom says, do you want to keep singing? Come over here by the table, let's work. Now she started answering animal questions about the animals on the pictures. In the first video, we were going through long periods of time just getting him to sit and to attend, and we were reinforcing every response. Now, I want to pause this so I don't want to lose it. Okay. The second video, he's coming, he's participating, he's sitting, he's answering. He's not giving his best effort. The teaching isn't perfect, but in 2 months' time, they're used the 7 steps to get him to start participating in everything that they want. And he's sitting for long periods of time to start the work. Another 4 months go by, working with the 7 steps, and this is now the teaching directions that mom has with him. She's just doing little voter orientation questions and recited language. Showing that it needs ears. What is she doing? Eating an apple. What is he doing? Riding a horse. Next, please. So what you see here is you see a completely non-compliant child, uninterested in participation, uninterested in following any instructions. Even come here, sit down, do this, completely unwilling to do any of that. We began to teach the parents how to use the 7 steps throughout their daily interactions. Within 2 months, we come back, and remember, we're only doing it with family for 2 days. Then we leave. Then we come back 2 months later, and you saw the second video. Now, mom and dad are able to bring him from reinforcement, sit at the table, do some simple tasks with him. He wasn't getting answers as quickly as we would hope. He wasn't focused on responding as well as we liked. But he was sitting, he was attending, he was willing to participate. By the time we get to the third video, it's now a total of 6 months later. Again, the family's only had 4 days of service from us. But now, not only is he willingly participating, but he's interested in participation, he's happier, he's attending to the instructions to the best of his ability, he's giving his best answers, and the quality of what he's responding to has gone way up. By 5 years old, he was responding to nothing. By 5 years, 6 months, he's able to do halfway up the Abel's chart that I showed you guys earlier. So it's a big change, big difference. So how do we get instructional control? Well, I'm going to teach you guys the 7-step procedure. And for you to understand how to use this, you have to understand that all 7 steps have to be applied at all times. They always have to be available to you. You can't just do this in instructional control and say, okay, I did it, we're done. You have to always be interacting through these steps. I live my life through these 7 steps. Through the way I interact with any child that I come across or any adults who I meet in the street, I'm always keeping these things in mind. Because I know that these are the types of things that are going to allow me to have the best access to people, have the best teaching relationship with them. So let me go through some of these steps with you. Step number 1. Oh, I was answering questions before. I realized I didn't answer all the questions. Before we're done, I promise. Step number 1. Show your child that you are the one in control of the items that he wants to hold, play with, or have. In other words, you are the one who controls access to reinforcement. All of the reinforcers in your child's environment need to be in a situation, need to be put in a position where you can easily control access to them. If your child is coming into your room to work with you and you have toys and games playing all over the place, there's no reason why the child would interact with you on what you want him to learn when he can turn away and have access to other reinforcement. So we want to clean the environment of reinforcement access. I want to take all the reinforcement items, put them into boxes, put lids on the boxes, stack them up so that I can easily block them. If the child is bigger or stronger, we're able to put things on shelves, or behind a locked door, or in a locked cabinet. When I was helping my sister with her teenage sons who were refusing to do their schoolwork but were playing video games all day, I told her to lock the video games in the trunk of the car. Lock them in the trunk of the car, keep your keys hidden. If they want to have access to the video games, they better get their homework done. You do whatever it takes to restrict access to reinforcement. A lot of times, that means teaching a family to reorganize their house so that things are up high and away. Maybe they need to have an entire room that is filled with all the toys that gets blocked off. And if the child's not participating appropriately, you just take them out of the room. But whatever you're going to do, if you do not control your reinforcement, you have to do what? You have to physically control the child. You have to do one or two, you have to do one or the other. I can either be in control of the water and not let the child have the water, or I can physically block the child from the water. Which is a better teaching option? Well, people don't think about it, but this is a much better option. If a child is going to escape from my teaching, let's say we're interacting together, we're playing, and he has a toy, and he's playing with the toy, and he gets up and wants to leave my teaching setting. What is your first reaction, Jeremy? Grab him, block him, don't let him leave. I suggest you don't do that. I grab the toy. I let the child leave, but I take the toy back. I let him have access to escape. But what I have to ensure is that that the escape condition is far less reinforcing than being with me. That I have to do two things. I have to make sure that when he's with me, that I'm so reinforcing that he'll want to stay. And I have to make sure that when it does escape, that there's a vacuum, no reinforcement. Access to anything fun is now shut down, including my attention, including negative attention. I don't want to have any access to any form of reinforcement and escape. I do this first and foremost by restricting access so that I control when you can have it and for how long you can have access to reinforcement. Step 2, I have to show the child that fun. It's important that I make every interaction, every experience I have with the child has to be as enjoyable as possible for them, so that they're going to be willing to give up some of that time to work. If I'm expecting a child to come and sit down with me and just work for an hour, I'm going to lose, no matter how many pretzels I throw at them. It doesn't matter how many times I give them a piece of chocolate. If I'm not expecting to work with me for an hour sitting at a table and I'm not having any fun at all, other reinforcers are going to become more valuable. The people playing outside of the window are going to become more interesting. Climbing under the table and playing with string is going to be more interesting than my chocolate, because it doesn't come with the added work. What we do in our program is we recommend that at least 75% of all of your interactions are saved for reinforcement or pairing yourself with good things. You're laughing, tickling, having fun, engaging, giving 75% of the time, everything you do. Only 25% of the time will you be allowed to give instructions. Now, we want you to talk during the 75% of the time. You're able to use demonstrative language. Words like, good job, way to go, or I'm doing this, or you got the blue on. But not words that ask for something from the child. Look at me, do this, say ah. That language you never use during 75% of your interactions. I want the child to see thinking with me as mostly fun. That way, it's like putting money in the bank. If I sit down with you and I just keep putting money in your bank, keep putting money in your bank, you won't be so upset if every now and then I take a little bit back. As long as I keep putting more in than I take out. If I sit you down and I just start taking money out of your bank, how are you going to react to that? Even if I put 20 cents in, but I take $1 out, how are you going to react to that? Well, that's what parenting is about. We have to make sure that 75% of our interactions at all times are safe for fun and play. That means doing what the child wants the way the child wants to do it. I was given a question here, perhaps I'll work right in. What do you do if a reinforcer that the child has or wants is something that's self-stimulatory, something that's a stimulator? Like, if you give them a spoon, you give them a pen, and their behavior is this. Should you use that reinforcer? Should you avoid that reinforcer? Well, let's talk about that. All human beings are always behaving for access to reinforcement. Everything you do, there's a reason for it. There's some benefit that you see coming out of it. Maybe it's a short-term benefit, maybe it's a long-term benefit. Maybe you're just trying to maintain a friendship or a relationship. I do a lot of things that I don't want to do because it makes my wife happy. And she then in turn makes me happy. So even though I may not want to do anything in the moment, it's worth it for me to do it because the lost benefits of keeping her happy with me are there. If your child is strongly motivated by this and doesn't have a lot of other interests, if I refuse to use this as a reinforcer, basically what I'm saying is that you're not allowed to have fun around me. Anything that you want to do, I'm going to stop. And then I'm going to somehow convince you to do things you don't want for me. And then somehow I'm supposed to accept that you're not going to do, that you're not going to hit me or fight me or scratch or cry. That doesn't make any sense. If I want you to learn to do things with me, I have to be willing to do with you what you'd like to do. And for some of our kids, a lot of that involves self-stimulatory behavior. So if a child really desperately wants to do this, according to step 1 of instructional control, I have to be the one who controls the pens. I can decide when they get the pen, how often they get it, when I get it back. During free time, they can have it play with it all they want. It doesn't bother me. I don't have time to give them something more fun to do, so the fact that they're finding enjoyment in life, I think, is a good thing. Okay. If I take the pen away, they're going to do something else anyway. It's not like I'm going to stop self-stim. Right? I just rather be able to control it. But then, if I use it as a teaching reinforcer, the stim is constantly being paired together with work. So I ask you to touch your nose, or to come here, or to do something. The difficulty level of the work will actually start to wear off on the value of the stim. Because it's always being paired together, the work will become more enjoyable because you're getting the stim. Plus, the stim will become less enjoyable to the child because it's always paired with work. It's a win-win. The child will not use the stim as much when it's always being paired with work. So you're better off using your reinforcers, whatever they are, as reinforcement for teaching. This process of pairing is extremely important. The perceived value of an item, 2 items that are consistently paired together will gravitate towards each other. If I'm consistently giving a child a puzzle, which may just be a neutral stimulus, it's not fun, it's not bad, but they don't do anything with it, it's just neutral. But if I'm constantly pairing the puzzle with bubbles and tickles and music, and the child enjoys bubbles and tickles and music, and then participates in the puzzle because they're reading it, the puzzle itself will, the child will have access to the puzzle will seem more fun, and through that access, the puzzle itself will start to become more reinforcing. Once the child sees the value of the puzzle itself and sees that as a reinforcer, I can then use the puzzle as my reinforcer, and I can bring other neutral items in. This is how you can change and increase the quality of a child's reinforcers. But another important thing happens with parenting. I have to pair myself with reinforcement. Because I want the child to see me not just as the person who tells them what to do as the teacher, but I want them to see me as the bringer of good things. The person who, when I show up, everything opens up. Think about money. Money is a generalized reinforcer. When you go to work, no one pays you in, assume they don't do this in money, but they don't pay you in furniture, they don't pay you in food, they pay you with money. And money that gives you the opportunity to choose the food that you want. Well, because money is such a generalized reinforcer, it's actually more valuable to us than the things that we want. Hanging on to money comes with security. Money is a more powerful reinforcer than just about anything in the world. People are willing to kill for it. Now, we want you to become a generalized reinforcer to your child. We want you to always be pairing yourself with the reinforcers so that the child sees you as valuable as money. Oh, if I can just get mom to engage with me, she can tickle me, she can pull balls for me, she can rub my head, she can give me access to that brownies that I love, or dessert that I love. Mom is a generalized reinforcer. So we have to create that, and we do that through pairing. We actively sit down and engage in things that the child finds fun and make them better because we're a part of it. The child might love the swings, but I don't want the child to want the swings. That's not good enough for optimal learning. I want the child to want me and the swings. I want them to see the swings and go, oh yeah, I want Art to come to the swings with me. That's what I can teach. But how do I do that? Well, the swings are nice by themselves, but if I can stand in front and jump out of the way at the last second, hit in the butt and make funny noises, or drop a ball, they can't hit me and I can run and hide, or I can spin them and let them go, I can pair myself with swings, and I can make the swings more fun because I'm there and alone. That way the child isn't leaving me to go to the swings. There's no reason to. They would rather convince me to come to the swings with them. It's crucial to being able to teach them. And so we will teach at the swings with a paired relationship. Pairing is going to look different depending on the kids that you work with. And it's going to depend on the therapist. Everyone pairs differently. Here's just a video of some pairing being done. All we're doing is sitting and we're making the spinning toy available to the child. We don't have to take it away, because when it stops spinning, guess what? They need us to put it back on there. We're introducing things that the child finds interesting. We know he likes things that vibrate, so we're introducing new vibrating things. Once he's playing with something, we don't take it away, we introduce something else new. Once he puts down that first item, yeah, we'll pick it up again, because the restriction of reinforcement is step number one. The more physical and fun you can be, the better teacher you can be. Oh, here's Daniel. Remember I told you I started punching you? This is that moment. This is what I had. It wasn't what I taught him, it wasn't the way that I taught him, it wasn't how much prompting I used, it wasn't how much reinforcement I used, it was creating a paired relationship with him. That was the key to teaching him his first word. I'm going to keep moving forward here because we have a lot to cover. So, reinforcement has a tendency to rub off on neutral items, giving them attributes. People can become reinforcers, become generalized reinforcers. And we should always be praised, positively pairing praise with real reinforcement. For kids who don't find praise to be reinforcing, praise is a waste of time. Praise often ends up being aversive. You think about this. I ask you to touch your nose. You touch your nose. And I say, God, that's a good job for your nose, I'm so proud of you. Meanwhile, when the child wants access to the swing, that's not a reinforcer. that I'm planning on using. Oh, you touch your nose, there's this thing. Touch your nose, there's this thing. But if I'm always going to praise in front of the swing, the praise becomes an aversive, something the child has to get away from, get out of their way, before they get access to what they want. Praise becomes less valuable to a child if you use it in place of reinforcement. We don't want that. We never praise a child before reinforcement. We always pair them together. As we're reinforcing, as we're pushing, then we add praise on top of it. That will increase the value of the praise. Same thing with using a child's name. I never use a child's name when I give an instruction. Billy, 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 do this. Because the child hears his name constantly being paired with what? Instructions, work. I will use the child's name when I reinforce. Billy, Billy, have chocolate. Oh, hey, suddenly this is my name, it's important. Now I've done it. Pairing is extremely important. So what does this look like, steps 1 and step 2? Well, if we're working with a child with a toy, we have to not let the toy be the teaching setting. But if the child wants to leave, we let them go. And we clean up the rest of the environment so there's nothing for them to do, making sure if the child wants to come back. Up, we take the toy back, we let him go, and he chooses to come back to us. Now we're in a motivated learning situation. Now he has chosen to participate in learning. It doesn't mean he's not going to do it again. Now the dad is in a pair, we're just going to play along with him. But he's not going to give any instructions. But when he gets up, no problem, we can leave, we can take the toy back. Oh, you want to sit down? Okay, that's fine too. Rather than forcing the kids to sit, we give them good reasons to want to. These videos here are available online under YouTube. You go to Strand 7 Steps ABA video. Oh, we got rid of it. But we just, no worries, we just take the toy back, let him come back to us, or else he doesn't get it back. Let him see the difference between the two. Doesn't mean he's going to want to. But ultimately, if he chooses to, now we're going to teach him. This wouldn't work if the other toys lying around, would it? Okay. So, step number 3. Show your child that you can be trusted. This is hard for parents and teachers. What do I mean by being trusted? Always say what you mean and mean what you say. If you say your child should do something, then you need to follow through with that instruction. Don't allow access to reinforcement until it's followed. Too often our parents or our teachers or even us as therapists will say to a child, hey, don't do that, no, it's okay, that's fine, it's no big deal. Or a child refuses and they run away and they're like, I don't know how many times I've seen the parents who are sitting on the couch and a child will come running through singing the doll. And the parent will be like, hey, stop running, don't sing it out, whatever. Well, what happens is they might as well be saying, hey, good job, that was like fun, have a great day. Because that's what the consequence ends up meaning. And our fat children are not going to respond to words unless the consequence of those words fits with what we want those words to mean. So often we say no, but the child gets away with having fun anyway. So our no doesn't mean anything. We have to make sure that we're always to be trusted in our words. If you're going to say to your child, don't do this, well then you follow through. You withhold reinforcement and you don't give them access to it while they're doing it. Then when they make a better choice, then you can reinforce them. You know, if you need to prompt the child to be successful, that's fine. You can prompt for this step, that's no big deal. But I try to avoid forced prompts. Instead of forcing you to do it, because you can force them and throw a reinforcer at them, chances are it's not going to lead to, that's passive participation. It's not going to lead to active participation. What's going to lead to active participation is your willingness to say, oh, you don't have to do it, it's up to you. But I'm going to hold all the fun stays with me. And then for the child to say, you know what, I would rather be there with you. I try to create a situation, and I talk about this in my book. I want my teaching setting to be an oasis, like the oasis in the desert. Be the one place in the child's life where they can have access to anything and everything they want, as long as they follow my basic teaching rules, which is you respond to me on a 25% to 75% basis. As long as you give me a little bit here and there, I'll make sure you have access to everything you want, when you want, how you want. You refuse me, and everything shuts down. In fact, I even send the kids away from teaching. You don't need to be with me. I'm sorry, God, go away. Go walk over there for a while and see how much fun it is not interacting. If I can set it up where they can trust what I'm saying, I control the reinforcement, and I pair myself 75% of the time really well with reinforcement, this can work, and it does work. Step number 4, you have to show the child that instructions themselves will always lead to good result. Following instructions will lead to good result. I want to show that following an instruction will lead to the child's benefit. So I'm going to give them very simple instructions, things I know they can already do. And I'm going to give it to them often, at times when they might want to do it. And I'm going to make sure that it's always following a positive result, always following reinforcement. You saw that with Anton. We asked him to come and sit down. Every time he sat, he got a reinforcement. Then we asked him to sit quietly, and every time he sat and was quiet, he got a reinforcement. Then we asked him to do this, and when he did that, he got a reinforcement. However, in other behavior he chose, we were set what we meant. We without that reinforcement, we didn't have access to it. I'm assuming you guys, most of you know the difference between positive reinforcement and negative, is that correct? Okay. It's not that important to this discussion other than to say that you prefer to use positive reinforcement, giving something to the child's environment that increases behavior. When you use negative reinforcement, what basically happens is you become the negative, you become the aversive, and the child works to get away from you. That's the opposite of what we want. So we focus on positive reinforcement. Step number 5, in the early stages of instructional control, we reinforce every positive response we get. And then over time, we start to develop a variable ratio of reinforcement. We start to expand it out. And I showed you that video earlier with Josephine where we did just that. Step number 6. Do they have that PowerPoint? They don't, huh? Did somebody see that last one again?
Yes.
I know that was pretty good. I have some papers online. If you go to that Spotlight website, spotlightstrand.google.com, you can see where you can buy my books there. And then down the bottom, there's some videos of me giving presentations on YouTube. And there's also some links to papers that I've done. And you can find the 7 steps paper in there as well, which will have this. So, step number 6. Demonstrate that you know your child's priorities as well as your own. What we're talking about here is being sure that you know what your priorities are. Because you only want to reinforce the best of your ability to what you want the child to be doing. So, if I said to a child, say, Mama, and he says, yeah, and then he reaches and grabs the reinforcer out of my hand, you would want to let him have access to that reinforcement. The first instinct might be to say no. But some of you might actually say yes. If your child's never said mom before, it might be something you want to reinforce. It comes back to your priorities. What are the priorities in your program at that time? If language, reading those first of codes is a priority, and the child has never said mom before for that SE, I don't care that you grab a reinforcer. I don't care that you didn't say mom. I found something that I can reinforce to make more likely. I'm going to let her take that chocolate, and I'm going to give him one more, and I'm going to take it. However, if he's already able to say mom, or you think you should be able to say mom, obviously we're not going to want to reinforce that. Also, if grabbing is a behavior that we've already focused on and said, this is a problem, it's getting in the way of his learning. Because instead of listening to us and focusing and answering, he's just trying to grab all the time. Well, then we have to make sure that we don't reinforce the grab, even if he said mama and do well. Does that make sense? So we have to know our priorities. We also have to know the child's priorities. What would they like to be doing right now more than anything else? If we're interacting with the swing, but we know that they love chocolate, and they give us a really good response, it's in our best interest to pull some chocolate out as well on top of the swing. Or to say, you know what? I know you're having fun with the swing, but I know you want the video even more. I'm so impressed with you right now, now let's go to the video. Always use more and better reinforcement and better response. So if you get weak or no response, you're going to have a little no reinforcement. If you get good responses, you're going to have some reinforcement. If you get great responses, you're going to want to use larger amounts with better reinforcement. I'll do this with cookies. If the child is asking me for a cookie, and he says, cookie, instead of cookie, and I know he's capable of saying cookie, I might say, oh, it's okay, crap, it's time to piece off the video. And then when he says cookie, I give him the whole thing, or I'll give him two, because I want to make sure he sees the difference between those two without even giving the best response. Step number 7. Now, before we get into step number 7, let's talk about the first 6 steps. You control the reinforcement. You are more fun than you are at work, and you make everything that your teaching settings involve in as fun as possible. You can be trusted that if you say something, you mean it, and you will follow through. 4, if the child responds to any appropriate behavior that you ask, you're going to make sure it's important to them. Positive reinforcement. Okay? 5, you're going to make sure that you're using a consistent reinforcement pattern and then ultimately variable ratio reinforcement. And 6, you're going to use better reinforcement the better they do, and you're going to know your response, you're going to know your priorities are. All of that used together will give your child every reason to want to participate, to want to engage, to want to stay connected to you, to want to give you their best. Even with that, there's still going to be some abolishing operations that we can't control. There's still going to be some things that a child's going to say, you know what, I don't want to do it, I'm not going to follow it, even though I did steps 1 through 6. When that happens, that's when we need to use step 7. We can't skip step 7. If we do, it's not going to work. Step 7, show your child that ignoring your instructions or choosing inappropriate behavior will not result in the acquisition of reinforcement. This means that the second the child begins to misbehave or refuse instructions, you have to shut down access to all reinforcement immediately, including your attention and your words. If I'm engaging with a child who's trying to get to a toy, and I'm reaching up to give him the toy, and he yells at his sister or pushes his sister, my immediate reaction, ooh. I'm not as worried about his sister or that. I'm worried about if I'm handing a toy, I'm pulling it back. I want that reinforcer to immediately be further away from the child. I want to see if that behavior led to loss of reinforcement. There are 2 ways that we do this step. First one is a consequence called distinction. Now, the way we do extinction is a little different than what you may have heard of as escape extinction. Escape extinction generally means blocking the child's escape, forcing him to participate, and nagging him until he dies. If he's not participating, then you have to use those things as escape extinction. Well, I already showed you how we avoid doing all of that. What we do instead is we withhold the reinforcement and we wait. You saw us do that with Anton. We didn't make him stay with us. In fact, we took him away from the teaching setting. Said, fine, you need to be with us where the food is, and where the attention is, and where the toys are. You go away. Come back if you want, but then be ready to respond. Be ready to participate. Extinction is the process of not reinforcing a previously reinforced behavior. So if behavior is being reinforced regularly, guess what? That reinforcement is supporting the behavior. I only do this because it's being reinforced. And so if your child is behaving inappropriately, that means that something in the environment is reinforcing it. So to get rid of the behavior, you don't have to punish it. All you have to do is figure out what is that reinforcer that's being painted. And you no longer let that reinforcer follow. Well, if the child is knocking over plants, and it gets me to hang up the phone and talk to them and play with them and yell at them even, well, I have to make sure that the next time they knock over the plant, I stay on the phone and I keep my attention here. Because if I take my attention off and go engage with the child, that reinforcer is what's causing that inappropriate behavior to occur. So we have to use extinction. As soon as you see an inappropriate behavior, you have to some degree, do the opposite of what the child wants. And that means make sure that no reinforcement is available. You need to be aware of the extinction burst. When you use extinction, there will be an extinction burst. There will be a period of time that a behavior which is put on extinction will increase before it increases. Don't let that scare you off. Prepare for it. Know how to protect yourself and your child learning. But fight through it, because if you give in during the extinction burst behavior, that extinction burst behavior will become the learning behavior the child uses. Nonverbal kids to start talking is to give them a motivating operation for communication, and then to put their communication on extinction, so that they will extinction burst. And when they do, you can reinforce that and start to get sounds that you can then reinforce and build up. Very exciting, very interesting stuff. But in this case, in trying to reduce the behavior, the extinction burst is a problem for us because it's the child doing everything else they can to get their reinforcement. But as long as we hold, don't give access to reinforcement during that extinction burst time, with the reversible role, the child will demonstrate the appropriate behavior, and then will reinforce it. This period of time will generally decrease trial after trial. It's not linear, it doesn't go down, so it goes down pretty quickly. If I work with a child for the first time and they're willing to stay in extinction for an hour, usually the second extinction is 20 or 30 minutes. The third